coral reef is not a garden. It is not a collection of rocks covered in pretty life. It is a single, coordinated, chemical-thinking system, and it has been running quietly beneath the ocean surface for over 500 million years, doing things no garden has ever done. It farms, it evicts, it sends distress signals across kilometers of open water, and every single piece of it is connected. What looks like a backdrop for fish is actually one of the most sophisticated living networks on the planet, and almost nobody talks about it that way. So here is what is actually happening down there. A single coral polyp is a tiny animal, soft body, hard skeleton beneath it, no brain, no eyes, no nervous system in the way we picture one. It is about the size of a pencil eraser, and it looks almost helpless. But that polyp is never alone. It buds. It clones itself again and again, building a colony of genetically identical units, all fused to each other through a shared living tissue called the choanosarc. That tissue is not decoration. It is a communication highway. Chemical signals travel through it constantly. Alarm signals, resource signals, coordination signals, moving from polyp to polyp across the entire colony in seconds. One polyp detects a threat. The whole colony responds. That is not a garden. That is a network. And that is just one coral head. A full reef is thousands of those colonies pressed together across kilometers of ocean floor, each one chemically broadcasting into the water around it, each one receiving signals from its neighbors. The water above a healthy reef is not empty. It is dense with molecular information, a chemical conversation happening at a scale we are only just beginning to read. Researchers studying the Great Barrier Reef off Australia have found that corals release specific chemical compounds in response to specific threats. Damage from a grazing fish produces one chemical signature. An encroaching algae produces another. A bacterial infection produces a third. These are not random stress leaks. They are distinct signals. And other corals nearby respond to them differently depending on which signal it is. That is not a reflex. That is something closer to a vocabulary. Now here is where it gets stranger. Coral does not just react to the world around it. It actively shapes that world through a series of biological systems that look, from the outside, almost like deliberate strategy. Start with the farming. Inside almost every coral polyp lives a microscopic algae called zooxanthellae. This is not accidental. Coral actively cultivates these algae inside its own tissue, providing them with shelter and carbon dioxide, and in return, the algae photosynthesize sunlight and hand back up to 90% of the sugar they produce directly to the coral. The coral is running an internal farm. It is a landlord collecting rent in the form of calories, but the arrangement is tightly managed. When light levels drop, the coral adjusts the density of the algae inside its tissue. When water temperatures rise and the algae start producing toxins instead of sugar, the coral evicts them, expelling millions of zooxanthellae into the water in the event we call coral bleaching. That expulsion is not the coral dying. It is the coral firing a bad tenant and going hungry while it waits for conditions to improve. The tragedy is that if conditions do not improve fast enough, the coral starves before it can rehire. But the mechanism itself is not passive. It is controlled. It is a decision. Now look at what coral does to its competitors. A reef is not peaceful. It is real estate, and every square centimeter of hard surface is contested. When two coral colonies grow close enough to touch, they do not simply merge or coexist. They go to chemical war. Many coral species extend specialized filaments from their gut, called mesenterial filaments, and push them outside the body to digest competing coral tissue on contact. Others release sweeper tentacles at night, longer than their normal tentacles, specifically evolved for combat rather than feeding. The losing colony retreats, its edge tissue dying back, ceding ground. The winning colony advances. This happens in slow motion, over weeks, but it is a territorial boundary dispute running across the entire reef simultaneously, every night, invisible to anyone watching from above. And it is coordinated. A coral colony under attack from one direction releases alarm chemicals into the shared tissue network. The entire colony stiffens its boundary response, deploying more sweeper tentacles, thickening its mucus layer, reallocating energy toward defense. The colony is not thinking in the way a mammal thinks, but it is processing information, making trade-offs, and redistributing resources toward the zone of conflict. If that happened inside a skull, we would call it a response to pain. Now consider the reef's relationship to the fish that live on it. This is where the brain analogy becomes almost uncomfortable. A healthy coral reef actively recruits the fish it needs. Coral larvae, the tiny, free-floating juvenile corals that drift in open ocean before settling, do not land randomly. They navigate. Research published in the early 2000s showed that coral larvae use both sound and chemistry to identify and target healthy reefs from hundreds of meters away. They are drawn toward the acoustic signature of a reef full of snapping shrimp and calling fish, and repelled by the chemical signature of a reef dominated by algae. They are choosing where to build, Once settled, the reef and its fish population enter a relationship of mutual maintenance that looks almost like employment. Certain fish, parrotfish, surgeonfish, damselfish, perform specific ecological functions that the reef depends on. Parrotfish scrape algae off dead coral surfaces, preventing algae from smothering new coral recruits. The reef, in turn, provides food and shelter. But the damselfish takes this further. Individual damselfish actually farm their own algae patches on the reef, aggressively defending territories, weeding out algae species they do not want, cultivating the specific species they prefer to eat. A damselfish territory inside a reef is a garden within a brain, a managed plot inside a managing system. And the reef tolerates it because damselfish farmed algae patches create biodiversity structure that benefits the broader colony network. The reef does not evict the damselfish, it works around them. Now scale this up. A single coral reef system, like the Great Barrier Reef, stretches over 2,300 kilometers along the northeast coast of Australia. It contains over 600 species of coral, 1,500 species of fish, and 4,000 species of mollusk. Every one of those species is plugged into the reef's chemical signaling environment. Every one of them is both responding to and contributing to the information economy of that system. When a reef is stressed, by warming water, by agricultural runoff, by overfishing, the chemical signals it broadcasts change. The alarm compounds increase, the recruitment signals weaken. Larval corals that would have settled on that reef detect the distress chemistry from hundreds of meters away and redirect. The reef begins to lose its ability to regenerate, not because nothing is trying, but because the signal it is broadcasting is telling everything nearby to stay away. A damaged reef does not just stop growing, it actively advertises its own damage, and in doing so, accelerates the decline. That feedback loop, chemical signal drives behavioral response drives more chemical signal, is exactly how a nervous system in distress operates. It is a downward spiral of information, not just biology. And there is evidence that healthy reefs nearby can partially counteract this. Chemical gradients from thriving colonies can outcompete distress signals in the water column, drawing larvae toward health rather than damage. A healthy reef reaching chemically toward a damaged one and pulling recovery toward it. Not metaphorically, literally, in the dissolved molecular language of the ocean. None of this was visible to anyone who named coral reefs gardens, and the name stuck because it fit what the eye sees: color, stillness, branching forms that look like plants. But the eye sees the surface. Under the surface is a system that makes decisions about who lives inside it, wages chemical warfare along its borders, cultivates food through controlled symbiosis, broadcasts distress across kilometers, and recruits its own repair workers from the open ocean. Every coral polyp is running the same program. Every colony is running it louder. Every reef is running it at a scale we can barely measure. 500 million years of iteration. 500 million years of refining the chemistry, the signaling, the trade-offs, the responses. No brain, no neurons, no central processor anywhere in the system. And yet, the behavior of a reef, when you step back far enough and watch the whole thing, looks less like a garden and more like a mind, distributed, responsive, constantly processing, constantly communicating, constantly deciding what lives and what does not. So the next time someone calls a coral reef a garden, remember, a garden is passive. A garden waits, a reef acts, it recruits, it farms, it evicts, it signals, it defends, it decides. A coral reef is not a garden. It never was. It is a brain that learned to grow in salt water. And it has been thinking in its own slow chemical language for longer than anything with a skull ever has.